Hello, seniors. This is Mr. Lang. Please forgive me if I don't seem as jovial as usual. I just got through about 20 minutes of this lecture, and at some point the iPad stopped recording, so I'm starting over. I'll do my best to make it sound like I'm doing it for the first time, but just so you know, I too have lost work in the process of going online. So, we're going to talk about chapter 16 here. It is a relatively long chapter, and I'll do my best to move through these quickly. Where the narrator's giving his first real speech. We saw the one on the doorstep of the evicted couple. I think that one's questionable because, in a way, it seemed like such a bad speech. It was, we're law-abiding people, and what do law-abiding people to do? And the narrator's hoping somebody in the audience will know because he doesn't know. In this speech, although he doesn't quite have as many answers as probably we or he would like to say end up in this speech, it's at least a step in the direction of his identity and I think his uniqueness and his maturity as an individual, which is really what I think we've been waiting the whole novel in a way to see. This is kind of the climax, to see the narrator deliberately create an identity of his own. So we'll jump into these. First quote here. "Ah, here we are," Brother Jack said, leading the way through a dark rear door to a dressing room lighted by naked low-hanging bulbs. A small room with wooden benches and a row of steel lockers with a network of names scratched on the doors. It had a football locker smell of ancient sweat, iodine, blood, and rubbing alcohol, and I felt a welling up of memories. Here, you probably noticed, because the idea of memory is coming up, that there are a lot of different references to parts of the book, and you may have picked up even the blood and rubbing alcohol, iodine, which would have been, also used to treat wounds there. This seems to bring up our idea of the battle royal. But we also, if you are playing along at home, have some references to other earlier parts of the book. One that paradoxically will come at the end of this chapter is the idea of the dark rear door, the kind of shame that, a black person or a black man would have in entering a building that was, whites only or something like that, comes up. And so that may be a deep part of the narrator's past, maybe just the collective past of black men and women at this time. At the end of this chapter, he says, "No more entering through the back door. I've kind of become my own person." And so I think it's interesting that he starts with that. We have the naked, low-hanging bulbs. We didn't read the preface or the introduction. I forget what it's called, or the prologue. I guess that covers all my bases. But he's in that hole or cave or room or basement, whatever it turns out to be, lighted by naked, low-hanging bulbs. So it seems like almost a reference to that. And then we have wooden benches and a row of steel lockers with a network of names scratched on the doors. Seems very, very much like the room that the union meeting was going on in at Liberty Paints. And so it seems to be just a total kind of composite of future experiences, past experiences, his identity boiled down into this one setting. And it seems to be symbolic. I think if we're reading the book literally, he's just kind of having these memories or even these premonitions of different parts here. But it seems to be saying that, I think, again, this is the moment when these identities are combining, when he's kind of aware of who he will be, who he was, and who he is in this moment, all at the same time, somewhat miraculously. And I think that gets to especially the quote down here where he almost seems to dissociate or have an out-of-body experience. It makes some sense because obviously that would be a jarring mental state to have happen. But we'll get to that in a minute. So moving to the next quote, "I went across the room to a torn photograph tacked to the faded wall. It was a shot in fighting stance of a former prize fight champion, a popular fighter who had lost his sight in the ring. It must have been right here in this arena, I thought. That had been years ago." Excuse me. "The photograph was that of a man so dark and battered that he might have been of any nationality. Big and loose-muzzled, he looked like a good man. I remembered my father's story of how he had been beaten blind in a crooked fight, of the scandal that had been suppressed, and how the fighter had died in a home for the blind. Who would have thought I'd ever come here? How things were twisted around." So one thing that you're probably noticing is, again, that idea of sight and blindness that's coming up, huge in the book, and will just kind of be a bigger symbolic presence as we go on. You'll also notice that even though this man has a title, he doesn't have a name. The former prize fight champion, a popular fighter. That's as close as we get to any sort of named identity. And so I think, like the founder, he's somebody of note, but somebody who, even though he's of note as a black man, doesn't get the kind of privilege of being named, just as the narrator hasn't received that privilege, or at least directly yet. We have other parts here where he notes that the photograph was that of a man so dark and battered that he might have been of any nationality. I think it's interesting a bit that he says that, because I think if we look at other characters who would maybe be a bit quicker to associate nationality with race or identity, the idea of a man dark and battered being of any nationality, it seems to be a kind of place you would stand in, a perspective that you would have if perhaps you were some suppressed group, maybe even an enslaved African person. The idea of being dark and battered and not knowing what nationality that person was of. Again, I think the painful reality is that white people at this time, and perhaps still, kind of clump people of different races into one identity. And I think we've all heard that painful moment when somebody refers to Africa as a country, not as a continent, and maybe belies an ignorance of the kind of differences there, because of course there are enormous differences between the almost infinite number of groups in that continent, just like there are enormous differences between the almost infinite number of groups in this continent or any continent. But it seems like the narrator is definitely projecting a bit of himself to say that the quality of being dark and battered would lead one not to be able to assume a nationality. And then finally here we have the idea of this man being beaten blind in a crooked fight, the scandal that had been suppressed, and how the fighter had died in a home for the blind. I think this is very much like King of the Bingo game, that Ellison is saying luck, and more than luck, just the systems that are in place that are more powerful than any individual can possibly imagine. Those are the things that determine the outcomes of our life. In the same way the Bingo King was able to get double zeros on the bingo wheel, but then is horribly injured or killed at the end of that story, this fighter was in the same position. He was a little too good, a little too exceptional, a little too talented, maybe didn't wholly kind of want to compromise or abase himself to the white powers that be, the way maybe Dr. Bledsoe does, and so ends up dying in a home for the blind, almost like that vet who was a little too good of a doctor and in a sense was punished for it by having his credibility stripped, his sanity stripped, his ability to speak sense stripped, all of these different ideas being taken from him because he threatened to stand out in a positive way. I think we've seen that a lot in this book. The idea of True Blood being a character who's rewarded, in a sense, the most unconditionally by the white power structure, and then people like the vet, the surgeon who was literally saving lives, and because he was too good at doing that in a time when that wasn't desired, got punished. We again see that with this fighter, that he was too good as a fighter, and so there was a crooked fight that he was beaten blind in, and instead of dying this champion that everyone recognizes and is able to have a name that's said aloud, he dies in a home for the blind. I think it's kind of that cynical view that Ellison seems to have of the kind of personal chances for success that any individual should hope for, which is little to none. So, looking next here, I bent forward, suddenly conscious of my legs in new blue trousers. But how do you know they're your legs? What's your name? I thought, making a sad joke with myself. It was absurd, but it relieved my nervousness, for it was as though I were looking at my own legs, for the first time independent objects that could of their own volition lead me to safety or to danger. The narrator seems to very much be in a sense of dissociating or not identifying with his own body or his own self. He talks about, this idea of, but how do you know they're your legs? What's your name? His identity seems lost to him. And I think in a way it's because there is this crossroads that he's at, and he has this chance for greatness. He'll talk about that in the next quote here. But also because he has no idea which direction it could go. That the excitement that goes with that is kind of underscored by the nervousness. And we also have the sense that he isn't, at least initially, saying that any of these old identities or old experiences of his are informing him. He's kind of saying that he's being birthed for the first time and is a blank slate. And I personally don't find that a credible kind of claim of the narrators. I think clearly everything that's happened in the book up to this point has built him into the character who gives the speech that he does, that it's not this kind of miraculous new spontaneous formation. But the narrator may find that a more interesting story to tell because it lets him, loosen his grip on any sort of shame or any sort of regret that he may have over the person he used to be. So, perhaps the part of me that observed listlessly but saw all missing nothing was still the malicious arguing part, the dissenting voice, my grandfather part, the cynical, disbelieving part, the traitor self that always threatened internal discord. Whatever it was, I knew that I'd have to keep it pressed down. I had to. For if I were successful tonight, I'd be on the road to something big. No more flying apart at the seams, no more remembering forgotten pains. No, I thought, shifting my body to the same legs on which I'd come so far from home, and yet they were somehow new. The new suit imparted a newness to me. It was the clothes and the new name and the circumstances. It was a newness too subtle to put into thought, but there it was. I was becoming someone else. So we can have him end with this idea of becoming someone else, not kind of taking these old senses of himself. He does say that these are the same legs on which I've come so far from home, but they're legs that have only served the purpose of transforming him, taking him to Harlem from the unnamed South where he used to be. So I think he's very much willing and perhaps even eager to toss away the identity he used to have, at least until that point in the speech where he brings it up and is in fact kind of scolded for doing so. But the new suit imparted a newness to me. Clearly part of the excitement here is what the Brotherhood can do for him in terms of money, in terms of status, all the different kind of rewards that may be a part of that. Ellison, though, compares this with, I think, the more upset part of the narrator that's been developing this whole time. So that observed listlessly but saw all. Somebody who's not necessarily commenting on what they're seeing, but taking it in and feeling it. The malicious arguing part, the dissenting voice, my grandfather part, the cynical disbelieving part, the traitor self that always threatened internal discord. So this sense of self where it's a person who doesn't like what they see and feels like there's injustice, feel like there's persecution, and feels like there's a wrong to be righted through words or action. This part of the narrator he now sees as a liability. And he recognizes it, but he recognizes it insofar as he says, I knew that I'd have to keep it pressed down. I have to suppress this desire to criticize, this desire to have revenge. And again, I think we've had many conversations in class about how the cost of joining any sort of group or community is that you give up a lot of kind of your individual thoughts or actions or words. Not entirely, but, if you're gonna be part of a religion, I think most people would say that probably means that you agree with the basic tenets. You probably wouldn't be part of that religion if all you did was want to criticize every single piece of it. So, we're always kind of, I think, saying that we're going to agree and go along with things when we join a group, and a lot of times we probably are perfectly okay with that because that's what we actually believe as individuals. Sometimes we're not, and we stay quiet because we understand the power of the group, and the beliefs of the group are important, perhaps more important than our own, at least in that moment. And then there are other times when a group diverges from the ways that we see or believe in the world, we separate from that group. But the narrator is basically throwing away that sense that anything that personally he disagrees with, he's going to stay quiet about. He's not going to openly criticize. He's not going to separate from this group because, like we've all recognized, groups have power, even though we have to give up parts of ourselves to become parts of the group. that's often a bargain we're willing to make. And I don't think that's a bad thing by any means. I think we all belong to groups, again, that we're thrilled to be a part of, whether it's, a religion or a political party or a family or a school or, a country, whatever it is. We all look at certain things and say, well, not exactly how I'd do it, but you know what? I love this group far more than I dislike this one little part of it. And so I'm for the group wholeheartedly. I think, we all have examples of that. The narrator is saying this is a group he's part of, but again, I think going back to why, it would seem to be the status and perhaps even the material status, the wealth that it could offer him. All right, so moving on here. My mind flowed. There was a child standing in rompers outside a chicken wire fence, looking in upon a huge black and white dog, log chained to an apple tree. It was Master the bulldog, and I was the child who was afraid to touch him. Although panting with heat, he seemed to grin back at me like a fat, good-natured man, the saliva roping silvery from his jowls. And as the voices of the crowd churned and mounted and became an impatient splatter of hand claps, I thought of Master's low hoarse growl. He had barked with the same note when angry or when being brought his dinner, when lazily snapping flies or when tearing an intruder to shreds. I liked but didn't trust old Master. I wanted to please but did not trust the crowd. Then I looked at Brother Jack and grinned. That was it. In some ways, he was like a toy bull terrier. So the biggest thing here is just the Master, this bulldog that, terrified the narrator as a child. In the South, perhaps, in a plantation or a sharecropper farm that he worked on or something like that, that was threatening, is the crowd. And the comparison there is that it's a powerful force, a force that can destroy, a force that can just kind of be amusing, but you don't know. As the narrator says, he barked the same note when angry or when being brought his dinner, when lazily snapping flies or when tearing an intruder to shreds. I liked but didn't trust old Master. That a crowd can be an incredibly intoxicating force. It can be a powerful force. It can be a positive force, but it can also be a very destructive, fickle, negative force. And so I think the narrator's rightfully saying that he has as much understanding of this crowd and why it's making the sounds that it is as he did of Master the Bulldog and why Master the Bulldog was making the sounds that he did, which was absolutely zero understanding, that you were just kind of hoping for the best, that you were reading the situation correctly, that you knew what was happening in the mind of this other thing you couldn't possibly imagine what was happening in the mind of, and got along all right with it. I think the narrator, again, is realizing the power, but also, the complete incomprehensibility of crowd. You'll never understand in that group think sort of way what a crowd is capable of or what a crowd is going to do next. All right. So ahead, a slanting shaft of brightness marked the entrance to one of the levels of the arena, and now as we passed it, the crowd let out a roar. Then swiftly we were in the dark again, and climbing the roar seeming to sink below us, and we were moved into a bright blue light and down a ramp, to each side of which, stretching away in a curve, I could see rows of blurred faces. Then suddenly I was blinded and felt myself crash into the man ahead of me. It always happens the first time, he shouted, stopping to let me get my balance, his voice small in the roar. It's the spotlight. So we have the narrator moving. I mean, there's almost a weird, again, if this is kind of an out-of-body, near-death experience, slanting shaft of brightness. Entrance to one level of the arena. We were in the dark again, moved into a bright blue light. There were rows of blurred faces. I mean, it does seem like this kind of classic near-death move into the light sort of experience that's happening. And again, whether or not this is kind of rebirth or some symbolic resurrection, I guess that's up to you. But it strikes me how close to that kind of image of death and dying that we often hear, especially as part of a near-death experience that somebody may have, that seems to be. The other interesting thing from this is, again, the sense of blindness, that suddenly the narrator is blinded. And of course, we've seen blindness with Homer Barbie, with, various kind of other instances here. Again, the idea of invisibility playing there. But the man saying it always happens the first time, it's the spotlight. The idea of the spotlight seeming to be maybe the attention that you get, again, in positive and negative ways, and what the crowd is capable of. That you're always blinded the first time when you receive a lot of attention or a lot of praise. And again, I think that's a very true statement that Ellison makes about the human condition. If we haven't yet, it's probably close on the horizon, that great feeling of professional or academic or social success. And the first time that happens, you feel like you're unbeatable, that you're something the world has never seen before. And then I think after that, again, you kind of get the sense of, oh, all right, so that was a particularly kind of good experience, and now I've got to work up to that and learn why it happened and how I can, keep having kind of success in this or that. But that first time, it's utterly blinding, and it's because the success is kind of so overwhelming. So that's what I take the idea of spotlight to be, that success or attention, and the idea of his blindness, just how that can kind of close off your perception of what's actually happening, especially what you've actually done to make that success possible. So moving on to the next part here, that was all I needed. I'd made a contact, and it was as though his voice was that of them all. I was wound up, nervous. I might have been anyone, might have been trying to speak in a foreign language, for I couldn't remember the correct words and phrases from the pamphlets. I had to fall back upon tradition, and since it was a political meeting, I selected one of the political techniques that I'd heard so often at home, the old down-to-earth, I'm sick and tired of the way they've been treating us approach. The narrator here, again, I think realizing if part of the build-up here has been him saying, I'm this brand new person who's going to be born in success and never experience anything but success, realizing at least in this moment that it's not going to be that easy. He forgets the correct words and phrases from the pamphlets. And we'll see that again by the end when he's criticized for not being scientific enough with this speech. But he has to fall back upon tradition. He has to go back to the experiences he's had, the identities that he's held, the places that he's come from, the people that he's met. And he says it's a political meeting, so he selected one of the political techniques that he'd heard so often at home. One of the few instances where the narrator, again, references a past that he doesn't share much with us. We've heard a minimal amount of his life as a child, that experience with the grandfather, that he sent a letter to his family saying not to worry about him while he's in New York. Very minimal discussion of the time that he had before the Battle Royal. This is one of, I think, those brief nods there. But anyways, the way he decides to appeal to people is the old down-to-earth, I'm sick and tired of the way they've been treating us approach. This very populist approach. And we hear that word a lot in politics at the moment. And I think it's, an idea that's always been enticing because it's very much kind of an us versus them ideology, that there's a powerful them and there's us, and we all need to stick together. And if we fight for them and fight for ourselves, we'll do better than we did before. I think it's a classic kind of political technique to say, be a populist and say, I'm fighting for everyone, and we're fighting against these, elites or the few that are powerful, trying to make everything equal for us. Whether or not it plays out that way, I guess that's up for you to decide in your voting adult life from here forward. But the idea of using populism to appeal to a crowd, because that's what the narrators heard, is clearly a reference to, I think, still modern politics, probably politics, period. Who cares about the modern part? So, moving on to the next quote. And do you know what makes us so uncommon? I whispered hoarsely. We let them do it. The silence was profound. The smoke boiled in the spotlight. Another strike, I heard the voice call sadly. Ain't no use to protest the decision. And I thought, is he with me or against me? So I think we see the narrator changing his point here. He says that everybody in that speech tonight, the audience, is an uncommon people. And again, I think this goes back to the populism. I think we often think of, if we're told that we're unique, thinking of that in a good way, that we're uniquely intelligent. We're more intelligent than the group as a whole. Not that we're uniquely intelligent in the sense that we're worse off. And the narrator flips that. If populism is the sense that we're better than they are, he seems to say we've consented to the pain that we've been put through, or the place that we have. Obviously still a controversial statement, I think, for any group, but especially for Black Americans. Kanye West, was heavily criticized a few years ago for saying something along the lines of, enslaved people in this country, in the 18th century were effectively choosing to remain enslaved. I'm paraphrasing there, and he had a whole explanation of kind of what he actually meant by that statement, but nonetheless, to say that people choose to be enslaved or choose to be abused or choose to be degraded in some way, incredibly controversial, upsetting, problematic statement. And I think we see that because the silence is profound, the smoke boiled in the spotlight. Another strike, there's been this whole baseball metaphor here of the narrator missing, not hitting these balls that are being pitched over the plate to him. And the man says, ain't no use to protest the decision. I think we could see that as his decision to say we let them do it, but also it's no use to protest the fact that the audience didn't like that. You know, you've got to figure out whether or not you're going to go forward. And going back to Master the Bulldog, the narrator's at a total loss to understand the mindset of the audience at this point. Is he, and again, if we go back, it was as though his voice was that of all of them, is the audience with me or against me? The narrator has no idea how to read them, how to appeal to them, how to kind of get inside their heads and see what makes them work. And this is one of those terrifying moments where I think he wonders if something that he said with "we let them do it" is kind of unforgivable, that he won't be able to walk it back. So he goes on, we'll be dispossessed of the very brains in our heads, and we're so uncommon that we can't even see it. Perhaps we're too polite, perhaps we don't care to look at unpleasantness. They think we're blind, uncommonly blind. And I don't wonder, think about it. They've dispossessed us, each of one eye from the day we're born, so now we can only see in straight white lines. We're a nation of one-eyed mice. Did you ever see such a sight in your life, such an uncommon sight? So it seems like he changes direction a bit here. And if the idea of blaming the audience, we let them do it, dispossess us, was something that he tried there, he changes it a bit. That even though perhaps it's allowed here, there's an explanation for it. And the explanation is that they've been dispossessed of their sight. Again, the vision metaphor, and they've been dispossessed, us each, of one eye from the day we're born. So their perception, their understanding is only working at half. It seems like he's changing it to say that the reason people are okay with it is because they don't necessarily want to be confrontational. Again, I think ironic, because the narrator started by saying that angry part of myself, that dissenting part of myself, I have to suppress. And the speech seems to be almost trying to play on that of the audience, that people have been too accepting, too kind, too forgiving, too willing to compromise here, that's been the problem. And so this will become an important metaphor for really the rest of the speech, but the idea that the they in this populist politics that he's using, which is probably a white power structure, have taken one eye from each black man and woman. I think it's the narrator catching himself in the speech, realizing that that last strike was one that could have struck him out, and changing his tone a bit and realizing that if he can't appeal with blame, he needs to, in effect, shift the blame and say, well, there's an outside force that's working against us. We're not necessarily ourselves working against us. It's them. They are working against us. And, as a speaker, I guess that's a clever decision to make if you realize you're sinking, but it seems to totally go back on what the narrator said about himself and how he was going to handle himself from now on at the start of the chapter. So at the very least, he's compromised that brand new, shiny morality he just created a few paragraphs ago. All right. So did you ever notice, my dumb one-eyed brothers, how two totally blind men can get together and help one another along? They stumble, they bump into things, but they avoid dangers too. They get along. Let's get together, uncommon people. With both our eyes, we may see what makes us so uncommon. We'll see who makes us so uncommon. And I'm going to read the next one because basically it went right along with it. Up to now, we've been like a couple of one-eyed men walking down opposite sides of the street. Someone starts throwing bricks and we start blaming each other and fighting among ourselves. But we're mistaken because there's a third party present. There's a smooth, oily scoundrel running down the middle of the wide gray street throwing stones. He's the one. He's doing the damage. He claims he needs the space. He calls it his freedom. and he knows he's got us on our blind side, and he's been popping away till he's got us silly, uncommonly silly. In fact, his freedom has got us damn nigh blind. So, a lot going on here, but I think the narrator realizes this idea of telling everybody that they're blind, but they're not entirely blind, they're half blind, and so if they partner up with somebody else, they then can figure out what's going on here is going to be his kind of rhetorical technique. This seems to be the argument that he's making, that pairing up with the other blind people, again, kind of going back to this populist message, is what's going to allow them to confront this smooth, oily scoundrel in the middle of the street who's throwing bricks at both sides, and both sides, because they're blind on that side, thinking it's each other. So he set this up. I think it's interesting, some of the assumptions that the narrator makes by choosing this condition of blindness, which is still largely an incurable condition today in a lot of cases. It seems to imply almost a metaphor of, I don't know what you would say, disability there, or at least medical condition, a sensory kind of deprivation going on. And I wonder if that almost gets again to the idea of biological inferiority that the narrator's trying to work against. He probably would never, like, we would never say that there's any biological superiority or inferiority of races, but I wonder if this metaphor of blindness almost locks him in to always kind of being in that system by saying, well, we're half blind. Isn't that in a way being a bit, I guess today we would say, ableist, or maybe just by noting that blindness could be considered a disability. I'm the one who's ableist, who knows? But anyways, it's interesting, I think, that he uses that metaphor. He also notes that there's this third party present in the middle of the street throwing stones. And it's interesting because if this metaphor is correct, you don't know. So there's the possibility that there's the third party throwing the bricks at both sides, but there's also the possibility that one side is still throwing bricks at the other and just saying that there's a third person here doing it. It's still a problematic metaphor, and I think it almost gets back to solipsism, or how do you know what's true? If you're blind and the narrator's telling you this, it could be true. That could be a perfect explanation, but it still could be that the group itself is divided and that people within the group are working against each other. So it's not a perfect explanation. It sounds nice, and I guess that's the purpose of his speech, at least in one big way, but I think it's a metaphor that's very problematic. I mean, it could work, and I think many kind of narratives of racial conflict would make this kind of, some white power structure, and then on both sides, maybe minorities fighting against each other, like the battle royal, all the boys fighting each other, while this kind of angry white power structure is amused and entertained by what's going on. But I think we've also seen through the book that sometimes the third person isn't needed at all, and that a lot of times not having a power structure that's kind of dominant would still lead to conflict. So interesting that Ellison makes such a complicated metaphor. All right, look down the avenue. There's only one enemy. Can't you see his face? It was a natural pause, and there was applause, but as it burst, I realized that the flow of words had stopped. What would I do when they started to listen again? I leaned forward, starting to see through the barrier of light. They were mine out there, and I couldn't afford to lose them. Yet I suddenly felt naked, sensing that the words were returning and that something was about to be said that I shouldn't reveal. I'll read the next one, too, since it just goes so well with this one. I haven't lived here long. Times are hard. I've known despair. I'm from the South, and since coming here, I've known eviction. I'd come to distrust the world, but look at me now. Something strange is happening. I'm here before you, I must confess. And suddenly Brother Jack was beside me, pretending to adjust the microphone. Careful now, he whispered. Don't end your usefulness before you've begun. I'm all right, I said, leaning toward the mic. May I confess, I shouted. You are my friends. I think that statement that he makes at the end there, you are my friends, is an important one, because obviously, going so far back as Mary Rambo, he's debated whether or not friends have even existed in his life. And so to call this crowd, even Master the Bulldog, his friend, is probably because in that moment they seem to be for him. But I think the narrator also realizes that a crowd is never truly your friend, that a crowd is this kind of changing, unthinking thing that you can never fully rely on or believe yourself to fully understand. And so it's interesting that he calls them his friends in light of everything that's seemed so clear about how dangerous crowds can be, or at least fickle crowds can be, the narrator set up to this point. It also seems as though this idea of regionalism comes into play, that the thing that he says that's so controversial is that he's from the South. And what this will get to in a bit is, again, this idea of identity. Is the narrator supposed to say, I'm just like you, and never give any sort of personally identifiable characteristic, like being from the South, like being evicted, like distrusting the world, even positive things? Because that kind of goes against the communist belief that the workers should all kind of be removed of traits that could cause identity and therefore division, like gender, or race, or class, things like this. Or is it just, again, that general regionalism that we saw when he was throwing out the pieces of the statue and the lady was, calling him a Southern N-word, clearly kind of playing on the idea of blacks from the South being different than blacks from the North, even two blacks from the North. So it's interesting that Brother Jack stops him and seems to say, your usefulness is in not having an identity, or at least not having a personal identity. Don't bring that out just yet. And so the narrator, I think, again, takes a left turn. If earlier when he said, we let them do it, revealing that he's from the South seems to be another moment where things could kind of go in either direction. And so the way that he recovers, what is it, son? What do you feel? A shrill voice cried. My voice fell to a husky whisper. I feel suddenly that I have become more human. Do you understand? More human. Not that I have become a man, for I was born a man, but that I am more human. I feel strong. I feel able to get things done. If Brother Jack was warning him that being a man from the South is a bad thing because that's too much identity, it seems like the narrator understands. It says, I've become more human. Whether or not people in this book have humanity, or at least are allowed to have humanity at different points, we could debate. But if you're going to try and connect with a crowd, saying we're all human seems to be a pretty good way to go. You have a pretty good chance of reaching everyone in that room. I think also interesting, and this got me thinking about the title of the book yet again. Invisibility plays its part in this chapter, but Ellison could have titled the book Invisible, and he didn't. He titled it Invisible Man. That idea of manhood or masculinity, or at least personhood via that that word, is an interesting one. And so he acknowledges at least masculinity, for I was born a man. Maybe that's a bit of kind of Declaration of Independence or Constitution there. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Maybe even some biblical references there. But gender is an important part. The narrator tries to step it back, but that I am more human, I feel strong, I feel able to get things done. It seems like he tries to zoom out to the level of humanity to reach everybody there. But as somebody who's been constantly robbed of his humanity up to this point, it seems like maybe a bit of an ironic thing to appeal to. So, moving on, someone took my hand and leaned toward my ear. You did it, God damn it, you did it. And I was puzzled by the hot mixture of hate and admiration bursting through his words as I thanked him and removed my hand from his crushing grasp. Thanks, I said, but the others had raised them to the right pitch. I shuddered. He sounded as though he would like to throttle me. And this is where we see the fallout of the speech happening here. But the narrator, again, fails to understand the contents of the reaction. Just like with the audience, he was constantly on edge because he knew that the applause could mean acceptance or anger, that it could mean rejection, that it was just this kind of literally faceless thing that he couldn't fully understand or trust or be able to predict. It seems that same way with this man, and if we're going from the group of the audience to the group of the brotherhood, he's just as incapable of reading the group of the brotherhood as he was the group of the audience. So again, kind of going back to that metaphor of the prize fighter, there's a mix of hate and admiration. The narrator's a man who was able to walk up on that stage, put the audience in the palm of his hand, make them love him, at least for that moment. And it seems as though, especially in the debate to come, that he's incurred the wrath of many longtime Brotherhood figures because he was kind of so successful that first time out, that they resent a newcomer, perhaps especially a newcomer who's black, not as educated as they are. We could pick all sorts of different categories that maybe they would hold over him in terms of their identity, but they seem to dislike his status and his rise in status the same way that the boxer's rise in status was marginalized, or the same way that the veteran's rise in status was kind of railroaded. So it's interesting that the narrator doesn't totally understand there. I think there's also a bit, perhaps, of baseball metaphor, raise them to the right pitch. There was that entire part about strikes and balls running through there. Make of that what you will, the baseball metaphor. I'm not enough of a fan or a scholar to make sense of it myself. But I think Ellison is such a wordsmith that he wouldn't have picked that just for maybe its musical meaning or something like that. All right. Blurred figures bumped about me. I stumbled as in a game of blind man's bluff. Or I think that should be bluff. I'm willing to bet that's a misprint of my pirated edition. My hands were shaken, my back pounded, my face was sprayed with the saliva of enthusiasm, and I decided that the next time I stood in the spotlight, it would be wise to wear dark glasses. Interestingly, again, I think a kind of recall of Homer A. Barbee, the blind preacher who's wearing the dark glasses giving his speech, and we wonder if he's truly blind at this point, or if to get used to the spotlight, he wears dark glasses, that's a way to kind of exist and thrive in that situation. Also, the narrator is using a game of blind man's bluff. We just had that long metaphor of the blind men walking down the road and having the oily scoundrel in between them throwing the bricks. He basically says, I bluffed my way through this. I faked my way through this. I didn't know how it was going to go. I was blind as to what was happening, and I won. So again, if that's a metaphor for somehow weakness, it's interesting that he applies it to himself in that moment. And we also have the saliva of enthusiasm. I think the narrator maybe is misreading that it could be saliva of enthusiasm, but just like he misread the "you did it, goddammit, you did it," and didn't understand if that was hate or admiration, this could be people literally spitting in his face as an act of degradation or an insult. So very complicated scene where the narrator is desperately trying in the moment to figure out what's happening to him. Are people spitting in your face because they're so excited to praise you that the spit is just flying out of their mouths while they're telling you how great you are, or are they spitting on you because they hate you? To the narrator, he doesn't really figure he can tell at this moment, and so he's going to hope it's the good one, play his own game of blind man's bluff with that. All right. In my opinion, the speech was wild, hysterical, politically irresponsible, and dangerous, he snapped. And worse than that, it was incorrect. He pronounced incorrect as the term described the most heinous crime imaginable, and I stared at him open-mouthed, feeling a vague guilt. We could, and were we in a classroom setting, maybe I'll ask this. I'll save this for a question to do in the comments. I've wanted to do that for a while now. What do you think is meant by the speech being incorrect here? That'll kind of be our question that we'll all publicly reply to under the questions for this. I'll explain a little more in the instructions there, but I'll leave that up to you. In what ways was the narrator's speech incorrect? And you could think of it as incorrect, period, kind of an objective, 2 + 2 does not equal 3 sort of thing, or you can think of it as incorrect to the Brotherhood or to this man in the Brotherhood. Either way, describe to me the way in which the narrator's speech could be perceived as being incorrect. And what do you think, Brother Restrum? He asked, pointing to a big fellow the shape and size of supercargo. I think the brother's speech was backward and reactionary, he said. I wanted to answer but could not. No wonder his voice had sounded so mixed when he congratulated me. I could only stare into the broad face with its hate-burning eyes. Brother Restrum will become a very important character going forward, but he's compared to Supercargo, and in the same way Supercargo was of the group of the vets and being a black man, he was also against the group of the vets. He would hurt them if they got out of line, and of course he's eventually kind of overrun and beat half to death by the vets in an act of kind of revenge. But I think we have to see him as somebody who is willing to kind of instantly shut down dissent among a group. He's even a part of like the Brotherhood, the same way Supercargo would be with the vets. All right, so it was the antithesis of the scientific approach. Ours is a reasonable point of view. We are champions of a scientific approach to society, and such a speech as we've identified ourselves with tonight destroys everything that's been said before. The audience isn't thinking, it's yelling its head off. Sure, it's acting like a mob, the big black brother said. One thing to note, because I'm hung up on pronouns in this book, is ours, we. Big difference between this speaker in the Brotherhood and the narrator. He's already making differences, and he's making the difference that he and the Brotherhood are intelligent and want to kind of spread that intelligence. I think, again, raise class consciousness, and that emotion is the antithesis of intelligence. A very kind of classical view of the human mind. We could take it all the way back to Greek philosophers. But we see this idea that intelligence is kind of the domain of the Brotherhood, that they are the intelligent ones, and anybody who's emotional is not intelligent and therefore not part of the Brotherhood. And the idea of turning a crowd into even more of a mob, even though it's a mob for them, this group in the Brotherhood seems to think is counter to what the Brotherhood should be about. All right. Stephen's problem, like ours, was not actually one of creating the uncreated conscience of his race, but of creating the uncreated features of his face. Our task is that of making ourselves individuals. The conscience of a race is the gift of its individuals who see, evaluate, record. We create the race by creating ourselves, and then to our great astonishment, we'll have created something far more important. We will have created a culture. Why waste time creating a conscience for something that doesn't exist? For you see blood and skin, do not think. This is the literature teacher at the college that the narrator is remembering. And I think it's an interesting take, and one that we in class have discussed a few times, that the deliberate effort to create a group or a society or a culture or a tradition or a ritual is probably, much like the mob, something that we ourselves don't get to control, or at least control very much, that it's kind of this organic, almost incomprehensible process that's too complex, too invisible, too long-lasting to truly understand. And so our task is not to necessarily be concerned with culture or be concerned with groups, but that of making ourselves individuals. And according to this professor, that once that happens, then the individuals, if they're all conscionable, will evaluate, record, create history, and then if we have conscionable individuals, we will have created conscionable culture. I think it's, in a way, maybe an optimistic view. Me personally, one that I find myself kind of identifying with in no small part because it's a literature teacher giving it, but is it unrealistic? Does it, again, reject the practical power of culture and groups and mobs and emotion and tradition and ritual? Is it possible to just always be thinking only of ourselves and not of the group that we're a part of, and our responsibility to that group and that group's responsibility to us? As much as I'd like to say I believe everything here, and that in a perfect world that would probably be how it worked, I think Ellison is one of those writers who reminds us that the way we would like to see the world is often as different as possible from the way the world actually is, and that's just the nature of dream and reality. So, last quote here. Did I mean that I had become less of what I was, less a Negro, or that I was less a being apart, less an exile from down home, the South? But all this is negative, to become less in order to become more. Perhaps that was it, but in what way more human? Even Woodridge hadn't spoken of such things. It was a mystery once more, as at the eviction I had uttered words that had possessed me. Again, I think we get to that idea of individual versus society, that to become a part of society, whether it's the broadest sense of human society, a group that we're a part of any measure, of any size, we're always giving up an element. And so does becoming a human mean giving up parts of ourself, giving up that animal part, that emotional part, that instinctual or maybe impulsive part? And in that way, to become human, we have to kill off parts of ourselves? The narrator seems to be wondering if that's the case, if part of becoming a group is always negative in the sense something is being taken away, that you have to become less to become more, that to become human, you have to give up something. I think one of the questions we have to ask at this time in terms of race is that the narrator is probably wondering if, in order to become fully human, do I have to give up my race, my cultures, my traditions, my beliefs, my experiences, my past, all sorts of things like that. And I think for most of us, if we were told that to give up something that close to who we are, especially something as sensitive as race is in this country, we'd say that that should not be a process of becoming human. That one ought to be human not by giving away parts of themselves, but by embracing those parts of themselves. So we'll stop there. A lot to digest. Luckily, you have a long break to do it. I'll try to get regularly on track again with pumping these out for future chapters, but I want to give people a chance to catch up and yeah, have a good break, as though, you know, it's probably going to look vastly different from the moment at hand, but nonetheless, it's a break, and you know, find some time to rest and take care of yourself in the process. All right, I will see you